This video is sponsored by Keeps. Neil was 46 when it was discovered that there was a malformation in his brain. Although this was, on the face of it, terrible news, sometimes terrible news presented at the right time becomes good news. Sometimes it doesn't. It wasn't quite clear yet what this was. The malformation was discovered after Neil had a seizure while at work. He was a professor of philosophy at New York University. While teaching his course, Pessimism, Despair, and Hope, suddenly, his head tilted up and to the side, his eyes rolled back, his mouth open like it was being pulled by a string, and then he collapsed backwards. The good news was, this didn't kill him, and it allowed the arteriovenous malformation in his brain to be discovered before it did. At the hospital, the doctors were able to embolize the brain hemorrhage that had caused the seizure, which occurred because of the malformation. The embolization filled the abnormal connections between his arteries and veins and prevented oxygenated blood from circulating throughout his brain. Even better news, the malformation was located close enough to Neil's skull where it could be accessed and removed completely. But there was a big catch. The malformation was located in Neil's frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for things like the way you think, problem solve, and engage with language. And so, one of the consequences of removing this piece of his brain was that it would likely affect his ability to think abstractly, to reason, assess, and comprehend theoretical and complex ideas. Of course, this was a central requirement for his work as a philosopher and a fundamental part of his identity. He could, of course, choose to not have the surgery and continue on as he was. But without the surgery, Neil risked having another brain hemorrhage that could kill him. Neil had dedicated nearly his whole life to philosophy. Starting as a young boy, he spent much of his time reading and engaging in philosophical questions. This was at least partly motivated by his circumstances at the time. At just 8 years old, he experienced the intensity of death and loss as he watched his older brother pass away from acute myeloid leukemia. This left Neil an only child. Not long after, his parents divorced. Some fair-weather marriages only become apparent when the first real storm hits. Neil's father was a hotel consultant who traveled and moved around a lot, often bringing Neil with him. Between the early death of his brother, the ending of his parents' marriage, the isolation inherent to traveling and moving around as an only child, and the widespread exposure to many different cultures, places, and aspects of humanity, particularly the problems and suffering that pervade it, all compelled Neil more and more toward philosophy, toward seeking answers and understandings. Throughout adolescence, Neil particularly found himself compelled toward philosophical pessimism. He would study and read the works of philosophers like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Arthur Schopenhauer, Lev Shestov, Emil Cioran, Peter Wessel Zapfa, and many others. In adulthood, he would become a professor of philosophy at several major universities and author 6 books, a couple of which became successful both in and outside of the intellectual community. He quickly became a well-respected writer and philosopher, particularly renowned for his dark, nihilistic, yet beautiful writing style. Neil's work often challenged accepted and acceptable viewpoints of humanity and existence. It viscerally embodied the feelings of alienation, bleakness, and absurdity, often both destroying and repairing the reader with the same line. It wasn't that Neil wanted to be pessimistic, he just wanted and needed to be honest and well-defined, with himself as well as the world. And in doing so, he simply found himself with this sort of pessimistic view and sensibility. The desire was truth and honesty at any cost, not bleakness or pessimism. But truth and honesty at any cost includes bleakness and pessimism. Now, Neil was left with the following 2 options: undergo the surgery and likely no longer be able to meaningfully engage in philosophy, or not undergo the surgery and risk dying from another brain hemorrhage. It wasn't quite that simple, of course. The odds of experiencing another brain hemorrhage that could kill him were around 60%. The odds of the surgery killing him were around 10%. So there were still some elements of convolutedness just in terms of survival. Also, it wasn't as if the surgery was going to make him feel or seem like a dramatically different person. The doctors believed that because of the location and condition of the malformation, it would most likely just affect his abstract thinking, reasoning, and comprehension of complex ideas. For many, this choice would be obvious. For Neil, it wasn't. For his girlfriend Maya, however, it was. "The surgery? You have to get the surgery. Is this seriously even a question?" she said to Neil while they sat on the couch after returning home from the hospital. Neil just sat there, rubbing his chin. His eyes bounced back and forth to her off the floor. "I don't know, I have to think," Neil said. "Think? That's your problem. You intellectualize everything, and now you're considering letting yourself die over the prospect of not being able to intellectualize everything? You've spent your whole life asking questions and thinking abstractly about everything. But what has that gotten you? Are you better off than before you started? Or if you never had at all? Have you found anything other than answers you either can't know or would have been better off not knowing? Depends on what you mean by better off, Neil answered. See? That's what I mean. Everything doesn't need to be so complicated. But everything is, Neil interjected. Everything is what you see it as. Maybe having a chance to see life without it always having to be condensed into precise reasons or abstracted into some theory won't be such a bad thing. Neil sat silently, staring forward, thinking. Maya began to cry. A couple days went by. One of Neil's close friends and colleagues, George, who was also a professor of philosophy at NYU, stopped by Neil's house to see how he was doing. Almost to a fault, George was an extremely straightforward, no-bullshit kind of guy, much like Neil. At some point in their conversation, after explaining everything, Neil asked George for his thoughts about the situation. Well, wouldn't you be dead anyway, if you got the surgery, and it took from you what makes you who you are? George said. How could you give up the ability to think and understand the truth of things the same way you always have? To be able to question things with that level of granularity you've dedicated your life to potentially not even care about contemplating things. It's like returning to the starting point of philosophy and not even choosing to pick up the first book. It's like trading everything you've worked for, a deep understanding of existence, for ignorance. Is that what you want? George concluded. Neil nodded at George as he exhaled with his lips clenched. That was something he probably would have told somebody else in his position. But actually being in a position is a lot different than telling someone what you would do if you were. Around a week later, Neil's father came to visit him, a very stoic, pragmatic individual. At some point in their conversation, after explaining everything, Neil asked him for his thoughts. His father said. I've always respected what you do, you know that. But I've never fully understood it, to be honest. I've lived my whole life without asking any of these sorts of, what do you call them, metaphysical questions, and I've been fine. You know what they say, right? Ignorance is bliss. Neil looked at his father. His eyes seemed to widen a bit as he did. But, his father continued, at the same time, there are things in my life that I would sacrifice bliss for, that I wouldn't want to live without. I guess you have to ask yourself, what's that for you? Is philosophy more dangerous than it's worth here? Or is it worth the risk? Neil spent the rest of the week thinking, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The next Monday, he had a follow-up appointment with the neurologist. He sat across from them in their office, looking down. So, the doctor said, have we decided? Are we moving forward with the surgery? Neil looked up and breathed in deeply. Yes, I've decided, he said confidently. This video was sponsored by Keeps. As many as 85% of men will experience some sort of notable hair loss by the age of 50. This is nothing to be ashamed of course, but it's also nothing that we need to freely accept if we don't want to. For some, hair loss is what it is, but for many others of us who value and prefer having our hair as long as we reasonably can, losing it can be a very upsetting experience. Keeps is an online subscription service that provides FDA-approved treatments and products that can help prevent hair loss and promote hair growth, making it so that you don't have to freely accept your genes or circumstances and can continue to live with the feature of your identity that you value. According to clinical studies, treatments offered by Keeps are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by up to 35%. Most Keeps customers notice results within just 6 months after starting their treatment. Without ever having to leave the comfort of your home, Keeps delivers treatment to your door at a price typically half the cost of going to a pharmacy. Via online consultation with a licensed medical provider, Keeps also ensures that treatment and delivery plans actually make sense for you and your unique needs. Keeps has helped nearly 1 million men keep their hair and has over an astounding 4,500 5-star reviews. Whether you're looking to stimulate hair growth, be proactive and prevent hair loss, or just take better care of your hair in general, Keeps is the perfect solution. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/pursuitofwonder or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/pursuitofwonder. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.